All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, a show about the incredible people dedicated to helping those who have experienced trauma. My name is Guy McPherson, and my mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to inspire each of us to help those around us. All right, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson, and this is the podcast now being listened to in 44 countries, where we interview master trauma therapists from all over the world to learn about what inspires them and the steps they've taken to become masters in their field. If you're a trauma therapist, if you're interested in trauma therapy, or if you're simply passionate about helping other people, this is it. Today, I am so excited to introduce my guest, Fran Waters. Fran, you ready to go?
I think I am, and I'm excited.
All right. So Fran is a licensed clinical social worker and marriage and family therapist in private practice in Marquette, Michigan. She specializes in sexual, physical, and emotional abuse and dissociation in children and adults. Fran is past president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, an internationally recognized trainer and consultant in the field of childhood trauma, and has conducted extensive training programs both nationally and internationally. All right, Fran. So just a little bit about you. Take a moment, if you will. Share with us just something personal about yourself. What's it like there, where you're living, and then we'll dive in.
All right. Well, I live in rural part of Michigan called the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's a wonderful, magnificent, bright, sunny day of 73 degrees, which is unusual for here. Fall is encroaching on us rather quickly. The colors are quite coming out quite brightly with reds and yellows. And I practice in a rural community, and I have a solo private practice. I've been in this community since 1980, and it's a wintry kind of place to live in the winter, but it's also quite beautiful.
All right. So let's kind of transition to our first topic here, which is a quote. This podcast really is about getting to know you, master trauma therapists, with the goal of inspiring other clinicians. In order to do that, we want to know kind of what's inspired you on this journey. Share with us, if you will, a quote, a mantra, whatever it is that's helped you kind of along your path.
Okay, well, let me first speak a little bit about what inspired me, and then I'll get to the quote, because it's really rather hard to explain what inspired me to work in this field, other than I felt like I was gravitated toward it, that there was this sort of gravitational force, and I'm sure my upbringing had a lot to do with it. My mother regrettably wasn't able to accept her 4-year scholarship in social work at Case Western Reserve in Ohio because of the depression, and her father needed her to help him in the department store. And I came from a family of helping those in need, and I love children. I love working with children. I love to see the transformation that takes place. So I kind of had no other way of being, I guess, other than being in this field. I'm sure there was some unconscious stuff going on myself related to my mother's fulfilled wish, but we never really talked about it. We never talked about what I was going to become when I started undergraduate school. So I felt like this was just something that I was meant to be, and I wanted just to state that, because I think this work requires a certain amount of passion and something greater than can be explained, and a drive that makes us want to work in this field. And then I'll get to the quote, because I think the quote has a lot of relevance to particularly the work that I'm doing in dissociation. I like Albert Einstein's quote. The quote goes like this: "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it." I think that's really powerful. And this quote has relevance to me on two levels. One, the child, and myself, secondly, as a clinician. So let's look at the child first. How does this quote pertain to children in this sense of consciousness? Well, the chronically traumatized children use dissociation to escape, of course, the horrors of what they experience. It's their best way of surviving what at the moment is difficult to even imagine. So dissociation is the opposite of consciousness. So the child, in order to recover, must begin to erode the dissociative barriers and to attain a sense of consciousness about herself or himself. The child needs to be mindful of the present, to stop using dissociative defenses to cope after the trauma is over with, which is very difficult because these children become so habitually trained at even minor stress to go somewhere in their mind to dissociate. So to become conscious means not using those defenses and facing the trauma and processing the trauma across all sensory domains as a way of becoming conscious again to the self, to the others, to the environment. So back to Einstein, you can't solve the problem of trauma unless you resolve the dissociation and unless you develop a level of consciousness, which is the opposite, of course, of dissociation. So the second part of that really pertains to me as a clinician. I needed to readjust my old paradigm of seeing these traumatized children as whole children with symptoms and just working and approaching them as if they are a unified child, as if there is one child there that was traumatized, and that was going to help them heal. Now, as I began to specialize more and more, and I worked for many, many years in Marquette, and even before then in my undergraduate years, I was fortunate to work as a therapist in a community mental health center. In my postgraduate years, I worked for 12 years at our local mental health center here in Marquette. And I was developing a specialty in severely traumatized children and became more and more steeped in understanding about sexual abuse and got a lot of training. And I recognized more and more that as I worked with these children, that I wasn't working with a whole unified self. I was working with a child that was fragmented, that there were different states of the child, different levels of consciousness, or I should say, levels of unconsciousness within the child, that there was this inner life that was so incongruent with what was going on in the external life of the child. And that in order for me to treat them successfully, I had to change my paradigm. I had to become more conscious of what was going on in the unconscious life of the child, what was driving that behavior, the different changes in their mood and behavior and memory problems. So that started me to begin to recognize dissociation in children, and that's kind of an interesting story about how that first came about. I don't know if that's something you would like me to elaborate on later, but I can if you would like.
Well, let's stop there for a second because you just blew that question out of the water. I mean, we could hit the stop button right there, and I think that would be an amazing interview. Fran, you just hit it on so many levels here, and I think really just gave me and I think our listeners a lot of insight, not only into what's driven you, but really into ways or perspectives of how to approach, individuals who've been traumatized. A couple of things that really struck me is I love the way you started this out by kind of framing what you were going to say by saying there was like some gravitational pull or force, I believe the word is that you used, that has really driven you to this work. You talked about your mom and her unfulfilled wish as well. And then, of course, that quote by Einstein. And I love how you, or how that's kind of set the foundation for your paradigm shift. That's really, really effective. And to me, I just got a lot out of you kind of juxtaposing, the two concepts of dissociation and consciousness and how that's playing out in your work with kids. I mean, just really, really insightful and helpful, I think, too.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's just, we can hear that, definitely hear the passion in your voice. So let's kind of maybe go a little step further here and, talk about I'll talk about a little more into what led you into this field. I know you certainly touched on it.
Mm-hmm.
For me, everybody obviously gets into this field for different reasons. And it really resonated with me, what you said about, there needs to be this passion. And for me, definitely there was. I mean, I've often talked about my brother, who's really inspired me. He came back from Iraq and the Special Forces with PTSD, and I just screwed it up. I was so excited to find out what his experiences were, what he was doing, and he just did not want to talk about it, couldn't talk about it, and I didn't know why. Mm-hmm. And I just kept pushing him, and now, obviously, I could understand that. So break it down for us. What led you into this field?
Well, I don't know, maybe serendipitous circumstances. I, graduated at undergraduate in social work, Ohio University. And then I had job opportunities. Back in 1969, there were many job opportunities then. And I gravitated toward working in protective services. I was a protective service caseworker in Columbus, Ohio. But I knew I wanted to do therapy. There was something driving me to do therapy. And lo and behold, at Case Western University, which is in northern Ohio, there was a week-long program on family therapy, play therapy. And I was a protective service worker, caseworker at that time, and I was able to take this training. So I took this training, and I began to do therapy with the kids that I was working with as a caseworker. And I pulled in some master-level social workers and psychologists to help me from the local mental health center so that I can learn to do something. I knew I needed to not just direct people. I wanted to inspire these high-risk families. I wanted to inspire these children to heal. There was something in me that was driving me, and I'm not sure what it was exactly, but it was there. And that led me then, after 4 years at doing casework and protective service work, and I look back at that and I say, well, I did my duty for my country. I felt like I served in the armed services because, I was hit over head in court by a psychotic woman when I had to go in front of the judge to help commit her. And I was followed by people. They weren't very friendly toward me in my position as a protective service worker. So I then, because of my experience in working with therapy with these kids, I then got a job at the local mental health center and then continue to work with children in the inpatient unit at the Columbus State Hospital, which was part of that assignment, as well as in the clinic. And then I went on to get my master's degree from University of Iowa, and my husband and son and I relocated then in Marquette in the Upper Peninsula here. And then it was the natural thing to do then was to work at the mental health center in the child adolescent unit. So, this was my many, many years of experience prior to graduate school and postgraduate. I worked at the mental health center. My first case was a 7-year-old girl. I clearly remember what she looked like, a cute little girl who told me her brother sexually abused her. This was in 1980. That's when I started to work at the mental health center. At that time, the Phil Donahue show was on, and I really liked it. It's not on now, and so I'm really dating myself by stating the Phil Donahue show was on then. There was a program on about sexual abuse of children, and they were showing these anatomically correct dolls. And I asked the clinic to order them, and they agreed. And I began to use them in helping children express what happened to them. I went to every sort of national conference available on sexual abuse of children, became a specialist in that field. I did forensic evals and treatment of children who were abused. And I began to then get more and more referrals of severely abused children, and they were, adopted. So I worked there for 12 years, and during that time I developed and ran a sexual abuse treatment team, and I had a well-developed treatment protocol. I was a bit sort of smug in my young years. I thought, I've got this down. I know how to treat these kids. In a year and a half, these kids were recovered. But suddenly, I had a kid in the mid-80s, like 5 years later, that wasn't recovering. And that was a turning point in my career. That's when I expanded my understanding of what dissociation in children looked like. And I'll tell you a little bit about that, how that happened. I had this little girl who was horribly abused. She was 8 years old, had just been placed in her adoptive home. And wonderful adoptive parents. They both were skilled in working with children. They were had careers in working with children. This little girl was the oldest of 5 siblings. I'll call her Lucy. She was severely sexually abused by both of her parents and their party friends, and she was forced to engage in sexualized behaviors with her younger siblings. She was physically abused with knife wounds and cigarette burns on her frail, thin body. She was the oldest, so she tried to look after her siblings and would go through garbage cans looking for food. They were all failure to thrive. I think you get the picture. I could go on, but I don't want to shock the listeners hearing more morbid stories about her life. So, again, after about a year and a half, Lucy came into my office. She'd been seeing me for a year and a half. She wasn't getting better, which was a bit surprising. So she was in my office as if it was the first time. And it was actually her first time to walk into my office, so to speak. This little part of Lucy looked around my office and was asking things like, "Whoa, what's that?" And she was looking at my shelf on my wall, and she was looking at some of the toys. "Oh, what's that?" Now, I was stunned. I thought, wow, but let me backtrack just a little bit to tell you a little bit more about the journey that led me to really recognize dissociative children. I was very fortunate. At the mental health center, there was a psychiatrist, Dr. Lou Kuhnhoff, never forget her name, had just given a 2-hour in-service on multiple personality disorder, and that's what they called it back then, as you well know. It's now dissociative identity disorder. I think she had just come back from the international conference on the study of multiple personality and dissociative disorders. So I was curious. I knew that abuse had something to do with MPD. I thought, well, I think I'll go to this. I doubted if I would ever see a child with MPD. I was sort of, a bit naive at that point. So anyway, I went, and Dr. Kuhnhoff began to describe symptoms of dissociation, including auditory and visual hallucinations, extreme mood and behavior switches, and memory problems, amnesia. So back to Lucy. So Lucy's in my office, and I have now some tools or some understanding of what I think might be going on, but I was totally dumbfounded and a bit frightened myself as to what I was going to do. So I said to Lucy, Lucy, do you hear voices in your head? And she said, yes. And then I took a deep breath and I thought, now what do I do? Oh, well, I would oftentimes ask her to draw pictures. So I said, would you like to draw a picture of what that voice looks like? And she said, yes. And she did. And she called this little girl Samantha. And then I panicked. I thought, what am I going to do next? I don't know what to do next. This was in the mid-'80s. So I called around, and at that point, Dr. Richard Clough was unable to assist me at that point. He was in Pennsylvania. But I was fortunate to find two specialists, Dr. Roger McKinley and his associate Ann Bailey, who practiced in Madison, Wisconsin, just 6 hours from Marquette, who worked with adult multiples. And they agreed to see Lucy and her family. So we all traipsed the 6 hours from Marquette to Madison for Lucy to be evaluated. So after 2 days, parents and I were sitting on the couch, and Dr. McKinley was looking at me from a chair and where he was sitting, and announced that Lucy was a multiple. And years later, he would tease me and said, the look on my face was as white as a sheep. And I was like, my goodness, what do I do next? So he and Ann Bailey graciously provided consultation with me, and we forged a wonderful working relationship. They knew about DID, multiple personality disorder. I knew about child development and trauma in children. Did not know about dissociation, that deeper level. But we combined our skills, and from that point on, I began to, quote, recognize dissociation in children. And I've become an international trainer and consultant since then. I say recognize because I look back and I think there were probably many that I missed. But that's sort of how things got started with me.
Wow. So what an amazing storyteller you are. I mean, that image of, from you starting out, again, you talked about this force that was driving you to do therapy that you really didn't know or don't know what it was. And then, through the different kind of levels of your experience, ending up with this young girl. Was there a sense that this was what you needed to do at that point? Was it because you've during this interview you've kind of made a distinction in a sense, or it seems that the spotlight is more on dissociation for you. Is that where you've been pulled more, would you say?
Yes. Although, I do work with children that are non-dissociative, that have trauma, but the more I learn about the neurobiology of trauma, the more I learn about the degrees of dissociation, that you do not have to have distinct states that take control of the body, but you can have aspects of the mind that hold different components of the trauma, the feelings, the emotions, the behaviors of the traumatic event, the memories, the physical sensations, the body sensations. The more I realize about the degrees of trauma, the more I realize that there usually is some degree of dissociation. It doesn't have to be the extreme, where there are separate personalities that take control of the body. But I think that we all have, different aspects of ourselves. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a therapist, I'm a friend, I'm a gardener, and we all assume different rules. I think what with dissociation and trauma that is so severe is that there's not the mind has segmented off these different rules, different parts of the self to survive, and it was all part of the original traumatic experiences and how they had to cope with it. And so they have these segmented parts of the mind that are not connecting with one another. And I think that the most important work that we can do is to begin to help the child, again, to become conscious of those different feeling states, of those different behavioral changes that they exhibit, and and to recognize how that is an expression of the unresolved trauma. And that is part of the integrative process, is to having the child own up to all that aspects, the different unique nuances within the child that helps that child to feel more unified, So, I don't know. I hope I didn't get off track.
No. I think that's a really great summary of what's going on. Let's move on here. You know, we've talked a little bit about your journey into the specialization of the field. Now, Fran, let's kind of focus on an early clinical error. Tell us a story about an early clinical error you made, and really what you learned from that, how that maybe has since influenced you as a clinician.
Okay, if you have time, I have two, and I could not decide on which one, so I'll tell both, and you can kind of decide on how you want to go with that. But I've learned two important things from my mistakes, and I have to continually remind myself of these mistakes, because I have a tendency to want to rush in and help these children, and rather than slow down is actually the faster rate of helping these kids. But one of them goes back to Lucy, the very first child that I just described to you that came in, in the 80s, and I didn't know what I was doing really with her. And I was anxious to help her. She was highly dysregulated, as you can imagine, with her history. She would switch rapidly from one state to another, particularly at bedtime. She would become hyper-aroused, giddy, angry, raging, crying, sobbing, all within a short period of time. Bedtime was really difficult. I'm sure it was a huge trigger for her when a lot of the trauma, the sexual abuse and physical abuse probably occurred. Her mother was wonderful. She would tried everything she could to help calm her down, would dress her in the dead of winter at nighttime with boots and overcoats and walk her up and down the snowy driveway to get her to calm down. And she'd finally fall asleep at nighttime. And she was so highly sensitized to minor triggers. Just talking about what happened would set her off. She was so unable to soothe herself. So what I learned from that is the importance of stabilization with these dissociative children, and particularly helping them with affect regulation and also regulation of their behavior. But affect regulation, I think, is so critical. I think the most deleterious impact of trauma on children is the dysregulation of the affect. If they are constantly in a state of hyperarousal or numbing, the brain isn't functioning well. It's not able to think clearly. So I have since then developed many, many strategies to help calm the stress response system, to get the higher part of the brain working. I've developed some hypnotic techniques with children to help them safely discharge a lot of their anger. For example, a lot of these children, of course, have rage. They have a lot of self-destructive and aggressive tendencies. And one of the things that I developed that I found to be extremely, extremely helpful, and the kids really seem to like it, and they get it right away, is they have such an internal life within their mind. They have a life internally that is so different than the external life. They create whatever they need to create to help them survive and to keep going. So it's very easy without any formal hypnotic inductions. You can suggest to children things. And what I suggested, and this started with one little girl, oh my goodness, it was like 5 o'clock at night. I had seen this little girl at various times of her childhood, and she was physically abused by her father, and his rights were terminated. And she started stealing things from the locker room at school. She was 13. She started doing a lot of odd behaviors, and she was referred to me again, and I asked her if she heard voices in her head, and she said, yes, I do. It's the inner voice of her biological father, which was the bad voice, and the internal voice of her mom, which was the good voice. Anyway, here I was sitting in this room, and this bad voice of hers, as she called it, the dad voice, was not at all going to agree to stop getting her to steal things. I mean, she was on probation for stealing, and she was unable to go to school at that point because she had stolen from the locker rooms. So I'm sitting there, and I'm really getting tired, and this part wasn't going to buy anything I said. And he didn't want to give her any control at all, and I was trying to use a little bit of cognitive therapy with him, and trying to rationalize with him about, well, this is going to get her in a lot of trouble, and he didn't care, and it went on and on. And finally, I don't know where this idea came from, but finally I said, and she was talking for him. She wasn't switching, but she was talking for him. And it occurred to me, this guy carries all the anger. And I said, I think this part of you has done you a favor. He's really carried a lot of anger for what happened to you. But in return, he's also taken control over your behavior. I wonder if he would be willing to take that anger and express it in a different way. For example, I wonder if he would be willing to have an internal anger room where he could have what he needs, like a punching bag and art supplies and things like that would help him get that anger out. And all of a sudden she lit up, and he said, yeah, he's willing to do that. I had such a sense of relief because I didn't know what I was going to do. And so he developed this elaborate internal room. And then I said, well, he could have anything in there he wants. And of course, he wanted junk food. I thought, interesting. And he wanted a swimming pool with a slide. I thought, this is not an internalized bad guy dad. This is a kid. And this kid probably took a lot of the physical and emotional abuse from her father. And he was willing to do all that. And I said, go ahead and do that. And he did. And I said, how's he doing? And she said, he's doing fine. He wants to go there now to get away from all of this. I thought that was kind of funny. Get away from having to talk anymore. And it was so interesting, though. At the end, he thanked me for providing this opportunity for him. And I asked if he would be willing to let us know what he was going to work the anger. What was he going to work on? What was he going to release regarding the anger? What happened? What did he take for her? And he said, no, I'll just work it out on my own. He didn't want to tell her. So really, this one was a protector part of her. So that was such a great experience. And I'm just really fortunate that came to me. I have no idea. Again, I think it was that divine intervention that it came to me. But I have used that technique over and over with the most highly aggressive, teenagers that were into a lot of serious behaviors and involved in the court system. And it has worked with these dissociative kids. I adapted it to also include a comfort room adjoining the anger room where they could go in and relax and have whatever they want in there for comfort, junk food. They oftentimes want food, pillows, funny movies, books to read, art supplies, whatever they want. One young man developed a whole dance studio because he liked music. And I found that to be very helpful, and I found that to be rather integrative because we are combining that rage with calmness and relaxation and fun. And these parts did not know what I meant by relaxation and fun. It took them a little while to kind of get into that. After they worked on the anger in the anger room, they were willing to go in and see what this was like. And that was very integrative because I was helping them blend their emotional states. So what I learned from this, that was the first thing, was that we need to calm down the stress response system before we can really begin to do therapy with these kids. Not do therapy, but before we can process their trauma. They have to calm down. And they also have to work with the different parts of themselves in collaboration. But the affect dysregulation was a real impairment to getting the higher part of the brain working. So that was the first lesson. Now, I'd like to tell you the second mistake that I made that I think is very important, if I may.
Sure.
The second one has to do with the importance of attachment figures in a child's life. I have learned that in order for us to do this kind of work, these children have to have a secure attachment, or at least someone in their life that is supporting them and rooting for them, that inspires them to face the tough work that they have to do. So I see the attachment as providing the anchor for the children to do this work. It's the anchor. It keeps them kind of stable. So I have learned that it's really important to focus on developing that relationship between the child and the parents, whether it's biological parents, oftentimes they're adoptive or foster parents, to teach these parents how to be empathic to the child, to be attuned to what's going on internally with them, and just not see the behavior as that's the kid and define the kid by the behavior. So that is one part of the attachment. But the other part that I found in working with parents is very important, that is easy to miss, because when you work with dissociative children, you're so focused on their trauma, their horrendous past histories, that you don't always recognize what's going on in the current environment that also causes them to rely on dissociation. So I have found that I've made this mistake, that I haven't gotten really good histories on the parents. A lot of these parents, they're good people, but they also have trauma histories, and that they're easily triggered by these children. These children are extremely provocative. They're used to getting negative responses. They're oftentimes have unresolved grief and loss issues about their own biological parents. And so they come with a plethora of lots of issues related in relationships, related to parents and related to people that they don't trust. So I remember working with, particularly with these two little kids that were adopted from Eastern Europe. They resided in the orphanage prior to their adoption, and there was Sarah and Rudy. Sarah was 3 years old, and Rudy was 18 months old at the time they were adopted. They were like feral children. They had to be taught to eat, speak, how to eat properly, speak. They were highly hyper-aroused and spent a lot of time spinning around and, agitating each other. They were quite aggressive, particularly Rudy, the younger one, was very aggressive. And he actually revealed to me that he had an invisible team inside that told him to choke his sister because they thought that they could eat humans and they were hungry. And, they did not understand that there was food in the family. They had their own little misconception about reality. And so they attacked the sister and choked her and had to be pulled off, of course. So and so these kids came with so much that I did not recognize maybe other things that also were contributing to Rudy's dissociation. I didn't do an evaluation of the parents' history because they came in as a crisis, and I wanted to get in there and I wanted to help reduce Rudy's aggression, and the parents were pretty worn out. So it wasn't until later that Rudy, in a session, and we were talking about things that made him scared. he told me he was afraid of his mom because she yelled and spanked him when he was younger. Now, his mother wasn't doing that when I was seeing Rudy, and Rudy, by that time, actually Rudy was 7 when I started to see him. So she had 5.5 years of dealing with Rudy without any help. And so I did not get a history on her. And I went and I spoke to her alone and found out that she had quite a history of exposure to domestic violence. Her brother was severely beaten by her father many times. She herself was hit and verbally abused as well. There was alcoholism in the family. And so in her heightened stress, she reverted to what she saw in her family, and that was hitting and screaming. And she was very tearful when she admitted that to me. She was very tearful, very sad. So we had many family therapy sessions, including her husband, and she apologized to Rudy and his sister, Sarah, and that was a real turning point with Rudy because while I worked with him on the early trauma of his being hungry in the orphanage, being neglected, he still relied on some dissociation, and I think part of that was that early fear about his mom hurting him, his adoptive mom. And that was really a turning point for Rudy. He did not need to use dissociation or think about using or being afraid of his mother. And she was employing really appropriate child management techniques with my assistance. So the word of caution is, while we have these kids coming in and the parents are in a state of crisis, they're oftentimes the family's about ready to kick the kid out, put him in a hospital or somewhere else. We need to slow down, and we need to really get a good history on the parents as well. Slower approach in the long run is a faster approach. So those are my words of wisdom.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, Fran, what you're doing here is not an interview. This is a mini workshop. Really, no, you're just giving us so much incredible information. I just briefly want to touch upon a couple of things. So really, you like you said, you gave us you shared with us two kind of early mistakes. First one was with the young girl you referred to before as loosely, and really, being cautious not to rush in. And you were talking about the importance of affect regulation and stabilization there. And one of the things that I really want to highlight, and I love what you did and what you talked about, was where you expressed this really gentle curiosity in the way you posed the question of, creating this comfort room or this anger room, that technique, in order to help these young kid kind of manage that arousal, that curiosity, right? Almost being there with the client as really an ally, not as opposed to coming from the perspective of, what's right, here's what to do. And that is such a great perspective. I love that. And the second thing you shared was, the importance of the attachment figure and really taking a careful history. Awesome. Again, this is just incredible information. Okay. So let's get to one of my favorite questions. We've talked a little bit about what got you here, some of the challenges. I also believe it's important that we know why we're doing this on a day-to-day basis. What's your why, Fran? Why you've been in this field for a long time. Mm-hmm. Why are you continuing to do this day to day?
Your questions are so good that really are very thought-provoking, and I really had to spend a long time sort of figuring that out. I'm not sure I got it all figured out, but again, there's something deep within my gut about helping children. I believe that if you are helping children, you are changing the world. That sounds a bit cliche, but I really believe that. There's something very deep within me that drives me to do this. First of all, I'm very fond of children, and to help a traumatized child recover, I think is the most gratifying work that I can think of doing. these children come to me so depleted of spirit. They have bags under their eyes due to a lack of sleep and constant nightmares, and the weight of the world on their small, droopy shoulders. Their minds are really fractured from their trauma, and they're in a state of confusion. They don't know where the world begins, where their body ends and the world begins. Their dissociated mind misses so much of the world, and they have been oftentimes demoralized by missed diagnoses, by treatment regimens that have been ineffective, including a lot of medications with side effects. They have, even their PTSDs is often unrecognized, even though it's maybe fairly recent. So as I work with these kids, they'll say to me, as I begin to really work on not their behavior, but what's going on inside of them at the time of the behavior, they'll say, "You're different. You really understand me." One girl, I'm very fond of her. She's an adult with a family now. We communicate occasionally. She was 16 years old, and she had dissociative identity disorder. She would probably meet the criteria of about every diagnosis in the DSM. Lots of comorbidity. Well, she fired me a couple times, but she kept returning to me. I asked her why, and she said, "You're the only one who knows what's inside of me." And I think those sort of words, that like I'm resonating with them, and they're being understood. I'm seeing the different parts of themselves, and I'm accepting them, and I'm accepting the parts as a complete whole of them. It's not that I'm seeing them as different personalities, different, but I see them as a whole, as a composite of the whole self. And that gives them a sense of hope. So to understand them and help them to tell about their inner world, their trauma, and to see this relief in them is very gratifying. I've seen children make amazing transitions in their physical appearance of being, like I said, downtrodden, droopy shoulders, to very upright posture with a light gait in their eyes, in their walk, and they go from pale faces with bags under their eyes. They have very terrible sleep problems, to sleeping well with bright faces, with bright eyes, and that is just absolutely rewarding for me. And they have a chance then to utilize their potential. These kids are amazing in their abilities. I'm amazed at what they had to do to survive. And when they can clear their mind, when they can feel unified, and they can then begin to shine and do the things that bring them happiness and rewards, that is just a gift they give to me as well. And I think that really moves me to continue this work. My sons keep saying, "When are you going to retire, Mom?" And I said, "Retire? What are you talking about?" So that's sort of what's motivated me over the years.
Yeah, well, Fran, it's just amazing. I mean, listening to you talk, and really honestly just thinking how lucky this field is to have someone like you, and how lucky your clients are to have someone like you, because your passion and sincerity, and obviously your knowledge is just amazing. So
thank you.
Yeah. So, many of our listeners just getting into this field, some have more experience. Again, you've been doing this for a while.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for those of us, maybe again, who are just getting into this field, who are scared to get into this field? Mm-hmm. What would you say?
I would say first learn all that you can about trauma and dissociation. Go to conferences. Don't give up on these kids. There's an answer. Their behavior has some meaning. It's up to us to figure out what the meaning is to help guide them. So learn all you can. And then I suggest that they seek consultation on a regular basis with a seasoned specialist in dissociation who can provide support, education, and guidance to them. It's tough work. It is very tough work, and you can kind of get into this work and lose sort of a perspective, and it's hard to get it to figure out what you're doing because it's so complex. You're treating children on a dissociative child's mind on so many different levels. So it's good to see consultation on a regular basis. And then I suggest that they engage the caregivers and helping them to help their children, that this is not just treating the child, it's treating the caregivers as an important component of the treatment of the child by building that attachment. And then, of course, taking good care of oneself and having fun, doing things that you enjoy doing, and that is really important to have that balance in your life. So,
okay, well said. So learn all you can about trauma and dissociation. You talked about not giving up on these kids and really about the challenge of this field, yes. I think, which is so true. Seek regular consultation, and also I really liked you mentioned, engage those caregivers for a number of reasons, so that they can help the kids, and also as a kind of foundation for attachment and, of course, self-care. Fran, what 2 books can you share? They don't have to be trauma related, but things, books that maybe have had a major impact on who you are or even the work you've done.
Well, there are 2 current books, and then there's a third that hopefully will be mine coming out next year. But the 2 current books, one is Sandra Whalen has edited a book called Dissociation in Traumatized Children and Adolescents, Theory and Clinical Interventions. Sandra and I were co-chairs of the Child-Adolescent Committee of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and many of our committee members contributed chapter to this book. This is a book that describes one case in really deep details, so a clinician can really see the process of treatment and recovery. The other book is by Joyce Selberg, and it's a wonderful book. It's called The Child Survivor, Healing Developmental Trauma and Dissociation. And she writes like poetry. She's got an amazing ability to enter into the child's life. Joy and I have consulted and collaborated and shared a lot of trainings together, and she's really quite a giant and a kindred spirit in the field with me. And then next year I will have a book out called Healing the Fractured Child, Assessing and Treating Dissociative Children, or Dissociative Youth, I should say. So. All
right, so 3 books. So Joanna Silberg's Child Survivor, and then Sandra Whalen's book. We'll have both of those on the show notes page at westcoasttraumaproject.com. Hit on the podcast tab, and Fran's page will come right up. And of course, your book, we're looking forward to that. Do you have a link for that? Is there, or that's just completely just not out yet?
Not out yet.
Okay.
It's out sometime later in 2015. It's in the last stages of the writing.
Awesome.
Yes.
So, Fran, what's the best way to get in contact with you if anyone wants to touch base with you?
Well, I have an email, franwatersusa@gmail.com. They can look on my website if they like and link with me through my website. That's waterscounselingandtraining.com. Okay, so that's email, franwatersusa@gmail, and the website, again, we'll have links for that. Fran, you, I've said it again, really just so inspiring. I mean, this is why I'm doing this. It's just amazing. For me, it's so inspiring. I wanted to help other clinicians, but I'm just sitting over here going, oh my gosh. Again, this really was a mini workshop in trauma and dissociation. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Thank you, Guy. It was really a pleasure and really thought-provoking questions that made me sit and reflect, which I oftentimes don't do. So thank you so much. Oh, you're welcome. All right, we will talk soon. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.